Welcome to another session of understanding how to write the essay for the scholarship exams. The essay or short story that you have in front of you with the illustration of the rock, as you can see, asks you to use your imagination. Now in this case, you have to come up with an idea for something along these lines. So, the student who's written this one has done a reasonably sound job. If you look at the introduction to what the student has done, it has been fairly effective. Now there are a number of grammar errors in this particular piece, as you will have noticed as you've read it. But the opening itself is reasonably sound. Now, notice what's important here. The writer has immediately jumped in, has not spent any time building up, ready to talk about the rock sometime in a later paragraph, but immediately mentioned the rock and what's going on. So if we just look at that opening paragraph, you can see why it's reasonably effective. So the writer states, "Sweat poured down my back as I lifted up my pickaxe and brought it down on the hard rock. Sparks flew and a chunk of rock flew from where I had made contact, missing my face by inches." Now that's not a bad opening, because as I said, the writer immediately jumps in without any hesitation about what's going on. The next paragraph continues the idea of banging into the rock and seeing it crumble and so forth. So the writer has done that reasonably well. You'll notice that the language that's being used, it's appropriate. There's nothing terribly exciting about it, however. But the good thing that the writer has done is each of the paragraphs are roughly about the same length, that all of that is fairly consistent all the way through. So the writer has done that reasonably well. The ending to the story, while reasonably sufficient, doesn't really grab the reader powerfully. And the reason for this is because it seems to have moved away from what it was attempting to say. If you read the final conclusion to the piece, you can see that it's not that interesting. "One day these people arrived at my front door and they said they were from the Guinness World Records. They said that I had beaten the world record of the most money earned in 10 minutes. Not terribly interesting along those lines. So that's where we've got to be a little careful with the conclusions along those lines. So you can see what the writer could have done there was perhaps made another aspect of how the rock could have been the important aspect of the story. That's why the writer got into the Guinness Book of Records, for example. So take note of the errors that have occurred as well. There is a few there. Certain sentences are grammatically awkward. Capitalisation is missing at times from this particular piece. The story doesn't have a title. Now, that's not really terribly important. If you can think of a genuinely good title, then by all means, then by all means place it into your essay. But if you can't think of anything, for example, to give this piece a title such as The Rock would not be terribly interesting and not very insightful, so you wouldn't bother. But if you could come up with something that's rather catchy and that fits genuinely into the story, then by all means do that, because that can be quite effective as well. But if you can't think of anything except a cliche, then don't bother. So again, to reiterate with this particular story, again, the opening I think is reasonably good, and that's because the writer has, as I said, jumped immediately in. Each of the body paragraphs is reasonably well detailed, but the writer does go off slightly on a tangent near the end, and the story seems to be in two parts because of that, and that can be a slight problem. The other aspect of the story is make sure that you choose an appropriate vocabulary. As I said, this is reasonably appropriate all the way through. But as I said, if you look at this second body paragraph, for example, the writer says, "I sat down and took a long drink from my gourd of water." Now, a gourd, of course, is all the writer needed to say there. He didn't need to say gourd of water, because a gourd holds water. It's also a plant, but it's also a device for holding water. So I stood up and ran my hand over the rock looking for weak spots. Now, take notice of the way that the sentence structure is very repetitious. It says, I sat down, I stood up, I was lucky, and so forth. Now, the writer could have changed that somewhat. With the pronouns, don't overdo them. Too many sentences beginning with those like I sat down, I was lucky, I found, and so forth is not terribly interesting. So the writer could have simply said something along the lines of, sitting down, I took a long drink from the gourd. Then the next sentence could have been, luck was on my side, for example. That way you're breaking each of those sentences by not beginning it with the pronoun I all the way through. And by doing that, what you're doing is giving your sentences greater variation. So they're the elements to always look out for. So if you find that your sentences are becoming repetitious, try to change them around, because that will only weaken your writing along those lines. As I said, this student's writing has been reasonably effective and therefore received a reasonable mark for it. And that's the way that you need to actually consider it. So basically, to reiterate once more with this particular story, try to make sure that the sentence variation is constantly changing. Make sure that the language that you've chosen is appropriate all the way through. Make sure that you immediately jump into the piece. You haven't got time to be sitting there writing a large exposition without mentioning the central idea of the story which you have been asked to write. So you've got to look at all of those aspects. You've got to say to yourself, okay, I've only got a short time. How am I going to bring this entire story into a beginning, middle, and end? The student has done this and therefore has been reasonably successful. But as I said, make sure that you do avoid those sentence variations where the student has done these aspects here, for example, as I mentioned. If you find yourself writing too many of these sentences, as this student has done, now, you'll notice that the student has that far too many times within that one paragraph. So, you say to yourself, all right, this, I sat down, I stood up, I found. Too much. You've got to make sure that your sentences are truly varied. If they're not, then you end up with this repetition, and that's the last thing you want. So you've got to break it down. Now, you can do that quite often simply by bringing in participles, for examples. You could say, for example, rather than I sat down, replace it with sitting down or standing up, for example. So any of those sort of aspects, and that way you've broken that monotony of those particular sentences. So if you can do that, you'll find that the writing will become a lot better and a lot clearer. So let's just quickly reiterate all of those ideas again. Make sure that you jump into the story immediately. Make sure that the language you've chosen is appropriate to that particular story. Check to see if your sentences are truly varied, and make sure that the story is logically connected from one paragraph to the next paragraph. Make sure that you do not introduce material that seems somewhat irrelevant. As I said, this story seems to be broken into two pieces, and that has weakened it slightly. But nevertheless, it's still reasonably effective along those lines. So they are the major elements that you need to actually consider when writing on that particular on a particular imaginative element, such as this particular one. So they're the major things that you need to do. If you can, make sure that you do improve your vocabulary as well. Try to make sure you've got a much stronger vocabulary at times than the ones that's being used in this particular story. Sometimes the writer has used words that are not genuinely interesting, and that's one of those elements. And as I said, there wasn't much left, full stop. I stood up and ran my hand over the rock looking for weak spots. I was lucky, and so forth. So if you can, it's a good idea to shorten sentences, especially if you're trying to create tension. If you're trying to describe, then the longer sentences are perfectly acceptable. But remember, make sure that you do check your vocabulary and your sentence structure, especially the sentence structure, because as I said, if it's too repetitious, unfortunately, the entire story will become rather uninteresting. So until we meet another time, thank you.